In human history, there are tragedies written not only in ink, but engraved in blood and betrayal. Stories of empires falling, kings going mad. But perhaps no collapse is more sudden and shocking than the story we are about to explore today. A tragedy, not just the decline of an empire, but the decline of a legacy, an ideal, taking place right in the veins of the most powerful family in the world. Let's go back in time to the Roman Empire in the late 2nd century AD. This was not a time of chaos. On the contrary, it was known as the height of the Pax Romana, the period of Roman peace. The empire was at its peak, ruled by a man who will forever be remembered as one of its greatest leaders, Marcus Aurelius. You may know him from his book Meditations, the memoirs of a philosopher-emperor, a Stoic who pondered the questions of duty, honor, and righteousness. He was the embodiment of Plato's ideal of a wise king, a man who wielded absolute power but wielded it with remarkable wisdom and self-control. Under his rule, Rome not only prospered economically, but was also a beacon of civilization and knowledge. The Roman people looked to Marcus Aurelius and saw in him the image of a father, a teacher, a protector of the entire empire. And so the hopes of the empire rested on the shoulders of the successor. For the first time in nearly a century, the throne would not be passed to a carefully chosen and virtuous adopted son, but to his own biological son. That son was named Commodus. All eyes were on the young prince, the one who carried the blood of the philosopher king in his veins. What expectations were there? They dreamed of a glorious dynasty to follow, a second Marcus Aurelius who would continue to lead Rome to new heights. They looked to Commodus and saw the future. Little did they know that the future they saw was an illusion, and hidden beneath the prince's facade, the seeds of chaos were waiting to sprout. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died. The light of philosophy and wisdom on the Roman throne was extinguished. Darkness began to fall. From the very first days of his rule, Commodus showed that he had no interest in ruling in the sessions of the Senate or in the burdens of empire. His heart was not in politics. It was elsewhere, a place of blood, sand, and roar, the Colosseum. And this is where our tragedy begins, the betrayal of legacy. Commodus was not just a bad emperor. He was the complete negation of his father. If Marcus Aurelius was the embodiment of wisdom, of self-control, of duty, then Commodus was the embodiment of impulsiveness, of violence, of selfish desire. He did not simply reject his father's legacy, he spat on it. He made a mockery of wisdom, he cheapened honor. Every act of Commodus was like a stab at the memory of his great father. So what happened? How could a branch from a great philosophical tree produce such poisonous fruit? Could absolute power corrupt a young mind? Or had that brutal nature always been lurking deep within, just waiting to be unleashed? This is a question historians have debated for centuries. But to begin the search for an answer, we have to look at where Commodus' mind was really headed. He didn't want to be a philosopher on a throne. No, he wanted to be something else. Something more primal, more powerful in his eyes. He wanted to be a god, but not a god of wisdom or justice, but a god of muscle, of pure violence. And in his paranoid mind, he found the perfect role model to emulate. That god was Hercules. Yes, you heard right. Not Jupiter, the king of the gods. Not Apollo, the god of arts and knowledge. But Hercules, the demigod of incomparable strength, of physical feats, who used club and fist to conquer every challenge. To the Romans, Hercules was the ultimate symbol of masculinity, a mortal who fought, conquered, and eventually ascended to Mount Olympus to become a god. And in that model, Commodus saw himself, or rather, the man he aspired to be. But this was not mere admiration. This was not an emperor taking a god as his role model. No, this was an obsession, a megalomania that had eaten into the very roots of Commodus's soul. He did not simply want to be like Hercules. He began to truly believe that he was Hercules reincarnated on Earth. The blood of the great demigod flowed through his veins, and his mission was not to rule the empire, but to reenact those legendary feats. And once this crazy belief took root, it began to manifest itself uncontrollably in the outside world. The Roman emperor began to change. He abandoned the majestic royal robes that symbolized Roman power and wisdom. Instead, the public often saw their emperor in an unbelievable outfit wearing a lion's skin, exactly like the skin of the Nemean lion that Hercules had slain. He held not a scepter, but a giant club. He minted new coins with his image on one side and the symbols of Hercules on the other. He had countless statues carved throughout the empire, depicting himself as a demigod with rippling muscles and proud eyes. It was a cultural and political shock. The emperor, who was supposed to be the father of all people, the primus inter pares, the first among equals, had now transformed himself into a mythical figure, a murderous maniac. But the madness did not stop at the image. Commodus began a campaign to erase reality and replace it with his own illusions. He ordered the months of the year to be renamed after his self-proclaimed titles, such as Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, and of course, Herculeus. And not only that, in his extreme paranoia, he also wanted to rename the eternal Rome. Rome would no longer be Rome, but would be called Colonia Commodiana, the city of Commodus. Stop and think about it. The most powerful man in the world is not just ruling, he is trying to bend reality to his will. This is perhaps the most profound act of psychological rebellion. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was a master of reason, of accepting reality and controlling the inner self. Commodus was the opposite. He could not face the overwhelming shadow of his father, could not surpass him in wisdom or virtue. So he chose a different path, a completely opposite path. He chose physical strength. He declared himself a living god, because only a god could be greater than a philosopher king. Commodus' obsession with Hercules gave him a purpose, a stage to display his divine side. And that stage was none other than the Colosseum. It was where he could truly become Hercules. It was where he could demonstrate his strength before thousands of eyes. But when a self-proclaimed god decides to step down from his throne to fight among mortals, will it be a display of divine power, or the most ridiculous play ever staged? When the sands of the arena were soaked with blood at the feet of the emperor, was it the blood of mythical monsters or the blood of trampled truth? The answer, my friends, is more disappointing and naked than we could imagine. Commodus' play, the performance of Hercules Reborn, was in fact a great hoax, an insult to the very spirit of the gladiatorial games which he pretended was to glorify. Picture this scene, the great Colosseum. Over 50,000 screaming people, dust and sand flying in the bright Roman sun. From the royal gates, a figure steps out, not in royal robes, but in the garb of a gladiator, his body oiled and shining, a gladius in his hand. It is Emperor Commodus. The crowd erupts, partly out of curiosity, partly out of fear, partly out of genuine excitement. They are about to witness something unprecedented, the master of the civilized world fighting as a slave. According to historians, Commodus stepped into the arena like this more than 700 times, and each time he emerged victorious. An unbeaten record, a living legend. But that legend is built on lies. It is a false glory. Behind every Commodus victory was a meticulously choreographed scenario. Look at his opponents. They were not the illustrious champions, the most skilled fighters in the arena. No. The emperor's chosen opponents were often gladiators In training, men past their prime, or worse. Untrained prisoners of war who did not even know how to hold a sword properly. They were sent out not to fight, but to die spectacularly. And the cheating didn't stop with the choice of opponents. It was also in the weapons. Commodus, of course, was armed with the best, a sharp Roman steel sword, a sturdy shield. And his opponents, they were often given wooden swords or dull metal swords, absurdly heavy and almost useless in combat. Imagine the despair of a man thrust before an audience of thousands, facing the ruler of the world, and his only weapon was a deadly joke. The fight was decided before it even began. It wasn't a fight. It was a staged execution. These gladiators knew their part. They had to fight just enough to make it look real, to not embarrass Hercules, but absolutely not to cause a scratch to the emperor. One wrong move, one too hard a blow, and not only their lives would be lost, but their entire families would pay. They had to act, stumble, and finally receive the final blow from Commodus to the cheers of the crowd. Commodus' glory was bought at the cost of the fear and lives of the weak. So why would a man with absolute power need such an elaborate hoax? Because deep down, Commodus was no Hercules. He was insecure and cowardly. He craved the admiration that a great warrior receives, but was terrified of the real risks of battle. He wanted glory without the sweat and danger. The Colosseum became his safe space, where he could act the hero without ever having to face the risk of defeat. Every cheer from the crowd was a shot in the arm for his fragile ego, helping him affirm his delusions of divinity. But a hero's legend is not built solely on defeating men. The mythical Hercules had to fight ferocious monsters, and to complete his role, Commodus had to do the same. He turned his sights from gladiators to the world of wild animals. But the way this Hercules went about his hunts would reveal a deeper, more pathetic layer of cowardice hidden beneath the brutal exterior. For the Romans, the venatio, or hunt in the arena, was an essential part of the entertainment. It was a display of imperial power, where the most exotic and ferocious beasts from every corner of the civilized world, lions from Africa, bears from Germania, tigers from the East, were brought in to demonstrate Rome's dominance over the natural world. Professional hunters, known as bestiarii, were brave men who faced mortal danger to bring down these monsters. It was a profession revered for its courage. And of course Commodus, in his Hercules role, had to conquer this challenge. The stage was set once more. The Colosseum roared with cheers. The iron cages were opened, and from the darkness the wildest beasts charged, their eyes squinting in the blinding light, confused and furious. The crowd held their breath. How would their emperor, their god Hercules, face them? Would he descend to the arena, mace and shield in hand, to reenact the legendary battle with the Nemean lion? No. The truth was far worse. Instead of facing danger, instead of proving his bravery, Commodus had something built specifically for his hunt, a balcony. A raised youth running around the arena, surrounded and protected by sturdy railings. From this position of absolute safety, our gladiator, Emperor, Hercules reborn, would begin his slaughter. He would stand high above, look down on the trapped animals, and casually hurl his spear or shoot his arrows at them. This was not a hunt. This was a long-distance execution. Cowardice was masked by a display of brutal skill. Commodus was said to have been a skilled archer. He developed special weapons to make his killings more spectacular. For example, he used sickle-tipped arrows designed to decapitate ostriches as they ran. Crowds would marvel at the sight of a headless ostrich continuing to run a few paces before collapsing. He killed giraffes, a gentle animal unseen in Rome simply because they were such a large and exotic target. He killed elephants, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses. According to the historian Cassius Dio, a living witness, Commodus killed 100 lions in a single morning from the safety of his balcony. Picture the scene. The arena is no longer a battleground of valor, but the emperor's personal butchery. The blood of the rarest beasts is spilled on the sand, not for the sake of survival, but to satisfy a man's sick ego. This is the height of power without responsibility or honor. He can do whatever he wants, and what he wants is absolute domination, without risk. Killing the mightiest lion without facing its claws, slaying a giant elephant without fear of being trampled by it, that is, the divine feeling Commodus sought. The power to judge life and death without paying any price. To many ordinary people, it was probably an impressive sight. They saw an emperor of superhuman skill, a master of life and death. But to the Roman elite, the senators, the patricians, who had been raised on the ideal of virtus, the courage and virtue of the Roman man, this was a contemptible spectacle. They did not see a god. They saw a butcher. They saw their emperor, the symbol of Rome, behaving like a spoiled child torturing caged animals. And the contempt did not stop there. It was deepened when they realized that Commodus' actions in the arena were not just a personal hobby. It was a declaration of war, a public humiliation aimed at their own class. To understand how deep this humiliation was, we need to understand the social structure of Rome. In Rome, honor was everything. Society was divided into rigid classes, and at the top was the emperor, followed by the senators in the Senate and the patricians. They were the keepers of tradition, law, and the dignity of the empire. At the bottom of society, considered the lowest class, were the infames, the disgraced. This class included actors, prostitutes, and, of course, gladiators. They might be popular with the crowds, but legally and socially, they were stripped of honor and most of their civil rights. A Roman patrician would rather die than be associated with a gladiator. And now imagine their shock. Their emperor, the living embodiment of Roman dignity and honor, had voluntarily thrown away his dignity to become an infamous. He was not just degrading himself. By entering the arena, Commodus was dragging the throne, the highest symbol of the empire, down into the mud of society. It was an incredibly powerful symbolic act. It was a message to the Senate and the entire aristocracy. All those rules, those traditions, those notions of honor that you worship, to me, they are completely worthless. I, your emperor, am a gladiator, and you will sit there and cheer me on. The humiliation was made even more bitter by the fact that the senators had no choice but to attend. They were forced to be present in the arena, to sit in their seats of honor, and to witness the abhorrent spectacle. Imagine being a senator, a man who had spent his life studying law, philosophy, and the art of government, now forced to applaud his emperor, who was performing a cowardly act, slaughtering disarmed opponents. You were forced to smile and cheer as he slaughtered gentle beasts from his balcony. It was psychological torture, a forced complicity in the decadence of the very empire you had sworn to serve. And sometimes, the insults turned into deadly threats. The historian Cassius Dio recounts an incident that makes the reader shudder. After killing a few ostriches and beheading them, Commodus walked up to the senator's table. In one hand he held the bloody head of the ostrich. In the other he raised his sword. He said not a word, just stared at them, silently nodding and smirking. The message could not have been clearer. This head could be yours. How horrified were the senators. Dio reports that they had to bite the laurel leaves from their wreaths to keep from laughing out loud, a laugh of horror and disgust, knowing that any sign of disrespect would be an instant death sentence. By these actions, Commodus was not merely seeking acclaim. He was waging class war. He was tearing apart the social fabric of Rome from within. By blurring the lines between emperor and gladiator, between the highest and the lowest, he was creating chaos, undermining the power of the Senate and asserting his own absolute, unprincipled power. He was not ruling the empire, he was playing with it. But the moral humiliation was not all. This grand and expensive play required funding. Exotic beasts, gladiators, weapons all cost a fortune. And the national treasury was running low. And as if forcing the nobility to witness his farce was not enough, Commodus then devised a way to make them, and the entire empire, pay for the humiliation itself, in a way that was unbelievably brazen and ridiculous. First of all, we need to understand that organizing the games in the arena was a huge financial burden. The cost of capturing, transporting, and feeding hundreds, even thousands, of exotic animals from all over the world was enormous. Add to that the costs of the gladiators, the maintenance of the arena, and all the extravagance that went with it. His father, Marcus Aurelius, had left the treasury depleted after the long wars on the northern frontier. Rome needed an austere emperor, a good financial manager. Instead, they got Commodus, a spendthrift devoted to personal fantasies. And when the money started to run out, Commodus came up with a solution that no one in history could have imagined. He declared that, since he had lowered himself into the arena to perform as a professional gladiator, he should be paid as a professional. And so, every time Emperor Commodus appeared in the arena, he sent a bill to his own treasury, to the Roman government. And what was the figure on that bill? 1,000,000 sesterces for each appearance. 1,000,000 sesterces. This number may not mean much to us today, but in Roman times it was an unimaginable fortune. To give you a sense of comparison, the annual salary of a Roman legionary, who guarded the borders of the empire day and night, was only about 200 sesterces. That means that for one afternoon of cowardice in the arena, Commodus paid himself the equivalent of nearly 1,000 soldiers for a year. It was an insulting figure to all those who worked and fought for the greatness of Rome. The ridiculousness of this act was that he was the emperor, and the treasury was essentially his. It was like taking money from your left pocket, writing a bill for billions, and solemnly putting it in your right pocket, and then praising yourself as an excellent employee. But for Commodus, this was no joke. It was an important part of his psychological drama. By charging a fee, he was legitimizing his role. In his mind, he was no longer an emperor playing gladiator. He was actually a professional gladiator, the greatest of all, and therefore worthy of the highest salary. More than that, it was a final blow to the Senate. He was not only forcing them to sit by and watch, he was forcing them to sign off on these insane expenditures. Every sesterce transferred to Commodus's personal account was an official acknowledgement from the Roman state that his shameful actions were a legitimate and valuable service. They were paying to be humiliated. Of course, with such spending, the treasury was quickly depleted, and to continue to finance his lavish lifestyle and his salaries, Commodus did what every tyrant does. He began to plunder. He framed wealthy senators and patricians for treason, executed them, and then confiscated all their property. The Roman Empire, under the hands of Hercules Reborn, was being drained of its own blood by its own leader in the service of an illusion. The madness had reached its peak. The brutality, the paranoia, the humiliation, and now the insatiable greed. Rome groaned under the boot of a tyrant. But just when people thought Commodus could not get any worse. He was about to show them that the depths of dehumanization ran much deeper. He would stage a final act, a grotesque drama that would erase the last frontiers of compassion and civility. If there was one act that could sum up Commodus' entire depravity, it was this one, an act that crossed the line from cruelty to pure evil. The subjects of this gruesome spectacle were not professional gladiators nor wild beasts. This time, Commodus targeted the most vulnerable in Roman society, the disabled. Historical records show that he assembled a group of Roman citizens who had suffered injuries from disease or war, especially those who had lost their legs. They were veterans, craftsmen, ordinary people. They were people who should have received the protection and care of the empire. Instead, they were dragged to the Colosseum to become props for the emperor's madness. But Commodus did not simply throw them into the arena to be killed. No. As always, he had to turn it into a play, a sick mythological reenactment. These wretched humans were brought to the center of the arena. There, according to some accounts, he had their lower bodies tied together or wrapped in strange sacks to make them look like snakes or half-human, half-beast creatures. In Commodus's twisted mind, they were no longer human. They were the incarnations of the giants of Greco-Roman mythology, the primordial enemies who had once challenged the gods of Olympus. And to complete the humiliation, the weapons given to them were nothing more than sponges told to throw them at the emperor as if they were rocks. It was a cruel joke, a public mockery of their pain and helplessness. And then, from the opposite side, our hero appeared. Commodus, in his resplendent Hercules costume, with a giant mace in his hand, strode forth. The crowd fell silent. This was not a duel. This was not a hunt. This was something else entirely. The Emperor of Rome, the man considered the father of all, was about to carry out a massacre of his weakest children and stage it as a divine victory. He approached and began to strike. One by one, he used his club, the iconic weapon of Hercules, to strike them to death. Humans who were helpless, were systematically murdered in front of tens of thousands of onlookers. This spectacle was the height of dehumanization. Commodus was not just killing, he was removing the humanity of his victims before he killed them. By turning them into monsters in his play, he gave himself the right to destroy them without feeling guilty. It was the ultimate justification of a tyrant, turning the victim into the one to be punished. This action revealed a horrifying truth. For Commodus, there were no limits. No act was too cruel, no humiliation too vile. A leader's highest duty was to protect the most vulnerable of his people. Commodus did the opposite. He actively sought out the most vulnerable, dragged them into public view, and destroyed them for his own amusement. This was perhaps the last straw. For Commodus' enemies who were hiding in the shadows, this was the final and irrefutable proof that the emperor was not just a bad ruler or a freak. He was a true monster, a threat to the very existence of all Roman values. When a ruler not only kills people, but also kills compassion, he has also written a death sentence upon himself. The blade was no longer hovering over the heads of the senators. Now it was turning around, aimed straight at the tyrant's neck. The end of Hercules was very near. The plot to overthrow him was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was now in full swing, and it was being carried out by those closest to Commodus. Those who had witnessed his madness up close, and understood that no one was safe while this monster sat on the throne. The conspirators included the commander of the Praetorian Guard, his closest chamberlain, and most shocking of all, Commodus's most beloved and trusted lover, Marcia. They knew that one outburst, One unfounded accusation, and their lives would be over. They had to act first. The plan was laid for the last day of 192 AD. Marcia would be the one to do it. She would poison Commodus with a glass of wine after he returned from the baths. Exhausted from a day of training, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Commodus, unsuspecting, took the glass from his lover and drank it down. The conspirators waited with bated breath. But then, something unexpected happened. Perhaps due to his high alcohol tolerance after years of partying, or perhaps because he was physically strong, Commodus threw up, expelling most of the poison. He became very ill, dizzy and weak, but he did not die. The plan had failed. And now panic gripped the conspirators. If Commodus recovered, if he realized he had been poisoned, how great would his wrath be? It would be all over. They had no way back. They needed a plan B, and they needed it now. And in that moment of desperation, they thought of one person. The only person with the physical strength to finish off a weakened Commodus, and more importantly, who could approach him without arousing any suspicion. That person was Narcissus, the emperor's personal wrestling coach. A professional athlete whom Commodus had hired to train with him to help him maintain the illusion of muscle power. Narcissus was summoned and promised a great reward if he completed the task. He agreed. He quietly entered the emperor's bathhouse. There was no arena, no screaming crowd, no magnificent Hercules costumes. There was only a sick man, staggering from poison. The living god, the Hercules reborn, the invincible gladiator, was now completely helpless. There was no heroic battle. Narcissus, a skilled wrestler, easily overpowered the exhausted emperor. He used the same strength that Commodus admired to strangle him to death right there, in the bathhouse. And so the reign of Commodus ended, not with a glorious blow on the battlefield, but with a quiet, humiliating, ironic death. Consider the irony. The man who thought he was a god died a mundane and pathetic death. The gladiator who claimed to be invincible was killed without a real fight. The man obsessed with physical strength was struck down by the very trainer he paid to feed his delusions. And finally, Hercules, the demigod who fought against monsters, was killed by a man named Narcissus, a name synonymous in mythology with pathological narcissism. History seems to have a cruel sense of humor. As soon as news of Commodus's death spread, the Senate, who had lived in fear for so long, took immediate action. They declared Commodus an enemy of the people. They ordered all his statues to be torn down, and his name erased from all public buildings in a ritual known as damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. They wanted to erase his existence from history completely. Commodus' death closed a dark chapter, but it also ushered in a period of further turmoil, known as the Year of the Five Emperors, and marked the true end of the Roman peace that his father had worked so hard to forge. The story of Commodus, then, is not just the story of a tyrant. It is a timeless warning about the dangers of absolute power, about the corrosive effects of an unchecked ego, and about the madness that can sprout even in the shadow of greatness. He was not just an emperor gone mad, he was a symptom of an empire that was beginning to rot from within.